Hi, my name is Luke Johnson, and I'll be presenting on psychedelics and belief change. This was me in 2017, in the summer before my senior year of high school. Despite how happy and hopeful I may look in this picture, I think I was just having a good day. I was experiencing a lot of stress and uncertainty at this time in my life. Not only because, like many high schoolers going into their senior year, I wasn't sure what I was going to do after graduation, but because I've been going through a major change in my beliefs. I was coming to terms with a lot of cognitive dissonance and came to lose faith in what were once deeply held religious beliefs. Seeking to better understand my loss of faith and seeking a secular perspective on religious topics, I feel lucky to have discovered Sam Harris around this time. Harris is an influential moral philosopher, advocate for secular spirituality and mindfulness practices, and a trained neuroscientist. Reading his work helped me reconcile my loss of religious belief with my desire to find meaning and purpose in life and understand morality outside of a religious perspective. Importantly, Sam was an outspoken advocate for psychedelics far before advocating for them was politically acceptable or trendy. Having already been curious about them, discovering what Sam Harris had to say about psychedelics led me to become even more curious. So, becoming a follower of his podcast, I, of course, listened to his podcast with Michael Pollan in the spring of 2018, which was part of Pollan's book tour for How to Change Your Mind. I was very excited to read the book, as by then I'd gone through quite a significant period of changing my mind. So I wanted to gain a scientific understanding of how psychedelics changed people's minds. After reading the book that summer, I was still left wondering, do psychedelics change minds? Do psychedelics change people's minds insofar as we tend to use the phrase change your mind to mean change your belief or opinion? Now, this is no serious critique of how to change your mind. I understand that the title has multiple meanings, but I'm only using this to introduce the topic. There's been quite a lot of progress in psychedelic research in the past 6 years since How to Change Your Mind came out, so much so that I've had to focus my talk to only a sliver of the research that's out there. First, I want to be clear that this talk is not about religious beliefs. Although my experience with belief change has been one of changing religious beliefs, our beliefs go far beyond our religions or lack thereof. We all have a unique and broad set of beliefs that are integral to who we are and how we act in the world as social beings. Additionally, when speaking about psychedelics in this talk, I'll be referring to the classical psychedelics, particularly LSD and psilocybin, because of their shared activity at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. So for a long time now, we've known that psychedelics can bring about intense, visionary, mystical, and oftentimes life-changing experiences, particularly when one set and setting, that is their mindset and environment, are conducive to a positive experience. More recently, studies have found that psychedelics increase openness, suggestibility, as well as psychological flexibility. These are all psychological states that are conducive to belief change, and these are just a few of the studies pointing to these effects. Given these effects and the ability of psychedelics to improve mental health when used strategically, it begs the question, is it an ability to enable belief change that might make psychedelics so powerful? Maladaptive beliefs are often integral to psychological suffering, which is in large part why cognitive behavioral therapy, aka CBT, has proven to be so effective. CBT targets maladaptive cognitive processes that often stem from maladaptive beliefs. If we want to better understand the positive potential of psychedelics, we should certainly seek to better understand how they influence our beliefs. Moreover, the need to understand how psychedelics affect beliefs has important implications for the ethics of their use. And further research on this topic could lead to advancements in our understanding of beliefs and belief change more generally. Understanding how psychedelics affect beliefs is crucial to developing our understanding of how to safely and effectively use them. It could also lead to discoveries regarding the neuroscience of belief change. Now, there's been about a dozen or so different studies looking into this question. Here are just some of them. I'm just going to click through so that anybody who's watching and wants to pause and look into these can do so. Most of these are survey studies, except for the second to last one there. And the last screenshot here is a skeptical review of some of the research on this topic. Well, I don't plan to go into those studies for a couple of reasons. First, it seems that psychedelic users represent a unique population with different personality traits than the general population. So the results from these surveys, might not generalize and are probably not representative of the effects that psychedelics have on people more generally. Additionally, people self-select for these studies, which introduces another layer of bias in the results. As for the clinical studies on the effects of psychedelics, existing research on how psychedelics affect beliefs in particular is quite limited. Most of the research is tangential, looking at suggestibility, openness, and psychological flexibility, as I had mentioned earlier. So for these reasons, I'll be focusing much of my talk on the theory of relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, or REBUS for short, because of the fact that it addresses this question most robustly, with a focus on integrating the pharmacological, neurophysiological, and psychological effects in a coherent model. This theory was first laid out in 2019 in this landmark paper by the psychedelic research maverick, Robin Carhart-Harris, and his genius world-renowned neuroscientist friend, Carl Friston. Before I explain Rebus, I'll provide a bit of background on the two key scientific theories it depends on, which are Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis and Friston's free energy principle. The entropic brain hypothesis, proposed by Carhart-Harris in 2014, suggests that consciousness is determined by the level of entropy or disorder in brain activity. Normally, the brain operates within a narrow band of entropy, reflecting controlled, orderly thoughts and perceptions. However, psychedelics increase this entropy, leading to more random and unpredictable brain activity, thereby expanding consciousness. This increase in entropy is thought to enable cognitive flexibility by disrupting rigid thought patterns. And the subsequent imaging studies over the past decade have generally supported this idea, showing that psychedelics indeed tend to raise neural entropy, and this correlates with the strength of their effects. The free energy principle posits that biological systems minimize a quantity called free energy, which is a measure of system disorder and surprise, to maintain homeostasis and adapt to their environment. In the context of neuroscience, our brains operate to minimize uncertainty and disorder so as to perceive reality as orderly and comprehensible. The process by which our brains do this is called active inference. Active inference is essentially an operationalization of the free energy principle to cognitive systems. And active inference suggests that brains constantly predict their sensory inputs based on internal models of the world to minimize free energy. And free energy in this context is the discrepancy between these predictions made by our brain's internal models, which are formed by our beliefs, and the sensory input we receive from the world. So by minimizing these discrepancies, the brain reduces uncertainty and surprise. A key aspect of active inference is that the brain's knowledge is structured hierarchically. Predictions are layered on top of one another, and at higher levels, the brain makes more abstract predictions based on deeply held beliefs, which influence and are refined by lower level sensory inputs in a dynamic interplay of top-down and bottom-up processing. Because of this hierarchical structure, at lower levels, we can quickly update predictions. Take, for example, in the case of driving a new car, our experience of how sensitive the gas and brake pedals are, quickly update our expectations for how much force we need to use to speed up and slow down. Updating predictions at higher levels of the hierarchy, however, is not so easy. So this is because our deeply held beliefs lead us to reinterpret our sensory inputs so as to minimize prediction errors. And these beliefs also lead us to take actions to avoid observations that violate them. Essentially, the more deeply held a belief is within our brain, the less likely it is to be changed based on sensory input or even memories that we have that contradict them. This is essentially the foundation of cognitive biases. So now that we understand the entropic brain hypothesis, the free energy principle in terms of active inference, and the role that hierarchical predictive processing plays in active inference, what is the Rebus model? The Rebus model posits that under the influence of psychedelics, the brain's hierarchical systems of control temporarily break down, meaning the influence that higher level priors or deeply held beliefs have over our perception of experience is greatly reduced. To make a brief political analogy, under the influence of psychedelics, the brain operates more like a state of anarchy and less like a hierarchical bureaucracy. Brain networks that typically exert strong top-down control no longer do so, and the brain becomes more susceptible to the influence of sensory inputs. These effects also seem to enable the experience of ego death that many people report having under the influence of psychedelics. So, what are psychedelics doing in the brain to make this happen? As mentioned earlier, psychedelics bind to the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. These receptors are prevalent on deep pyramidal cortical neurons, which encode higher level priors. Activation of these receptors increases the sensitivity and excitability of those neurons. And this aspect, though key, gets a little confusing, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but essentially the high level of 5-HT2A activation reduces the suppressive influence that these deep pyramidal cortical neurons have on lower level sensory processing and lower brain regions. This leads to the entropic effect that I described earlier, which is characterized by a decrease in the predictability of neural activity and changes in brain connectivity, particularly increased signaling between different brain networks, but also reduced signaling within individual brain networks. As a whole, brain activity becomes a lot less predictable, and reducing the control that hierarchies typically exert over our conscious experience. In this anarchic state, the influence of entrenched beliefs on thought processes diminishes, making these beliefs more susceptible to modification in response to new sensory information or even latent memories or thoughts. Thus the name, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So that was a lot. If you didn't get any of that, I hope these memes help. The meme on the left represents our normal waking consciousness, whereby our attention is drawn to conclusions that conform our pre-existing beliefs. And the meme on the right is one that I made and represents the train of thought one might have when under the influence of a psychedelic. So the Rebus model has a number of strengths. It integrates multiple levels of research into a compelling model. It helps explain the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, and it doesn't depend on how psychedelics may or may not affect one particular brain network or brain area. It is, however, limited in a few ways in that it is relatively abstract, still quite theoretical, and does depend solely on 5-HT2A receptor activity, when, however, psychedelics affect a lot of other receptors as well. So this brings me to perhaps the most important part of the talk, which is looking at the future directions for research on how psychedelics affect beliefs. I think the most logical next step when evaluating the Rebus model is testing its predictions in the clinical trials and clinical settings where psychedelics are being used. Earlier, I mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, aka CBT, and how it's a psychotherapeutic approach that is often used to address maladaptive beliefs. Given the prominence and efficacy of CBT and related models of therapy, I think borrowing from CBT the concept of a core belief, which I'll describe shortly, makes the most sense in evaluating how psychedelics affect beliefs within mental health care settings. So academics in the field have already pointed out the synergies between CBT and the psychedelic mind state. And it kind of seems like CBT and psychedelics are a perfect match. Now, I won't go into them, but these two papers I have on this slide cover this topic very well. So what is a core belief? It is kind of exactly what it sounds like. So these are deep-seated perceptions about oneself and the world, which lead to intermediate beliefs, which are rules, attitudes, and assumptions, which in turn produce automatic thoughts, which are spontaneous interpretations of situations. So you might notice this is sort of a hierarchy of belief processes, which should make some sense at this point. Here's a helpful diagram representing this layering of core beliefs, intermediate beliefs, and automatic thoughts. So cognitive behavioral therapists work with their clients to reverse order, identifying negative automatic thoughts, figuring out the intermediate beliefs that lead to them, and then identifying the beliefs that are at the core of these thought processes. And the right side of this diagram shows a particular example of this. So I thought I had a novel idea when going into the research process for this presentation, but it turns out others were already on the case. This article, titled "From Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics to Revised Beliefs After Psychedelics, Preliminary Development of the Relaxed Beliefs Questionnaire." Researchers developed and tested a new questionnaire specifically to assess the effect of psychedelics on core beliefs. They say in the supplementary documentation, the purpose of the Relaxed Beliefs Questionnaire is to measure changes in an individual's certainty in their personally identified core beliefs within experimental conditions and over time. Now, the study only had 11 participants, so it was just a pilot, but the results were promising. They wrote that confidence in negative self-beliefs decreased following 25 milligrams of psilocybin, and they found that entropy, here measured using EEG, and subjective effects correlated with the decreases in negative self-belief confidence acutely and 4 weeks after dosing. Particularly strong evidence was seen for a relationship between decreases in negative self-belief confidence and increases in well-being at 4 weeks. So if it's not already obvious, I'd like to suggest that there be more longitudinal clinical research and widespread deployment of this questionnaire, as it could prove to be a key aspect of mainstream effective and data-driven adoption of psychedelic psychotherapy. Although the Rebus model provides the most comprehensive model of how psychedelics likely affect beliefs, it is important that we explore this topic using other frameworks as well. First, I'd like to bring up this paper by Adam Safran, which suggests that depending on the dose of a psychedelic, they may actually strengthen beliefs. So this is also still quite theoretical as well, but there's some pretty obvious ways in which this could be further empirically tested, and it's important that this does get tested. So he's not discounting the Rebus model. He's only pointing out the fact that it seems that depending on dose, some beliefs might also be strengthened, which is quite interesting. In the psychedelic field, most of the brain imaging data we have is resting state data, meaning the brain scans are performed while participants aren't doing anything and aren't being presented with any stimuli. Earlier, I talked about Sam Harris and mentioned he's a trained neuroscientist. Most of his neuroscience research focused on using fMRI brain imaging to observe the brain activity of subjects when they were presented with information and analyzing the patterns of their brain activity, depending on whether they believed, didn't believe, or were uncertain about information. So I think an obvious and straightforward continuation of this research would be to observe how patterns of brain activity change within subjects when they are presented with information under the influence of psychedelics. Essentially, Harris's studies could be replicated with an additional within subjects arm, repeating brain scans using the same paradigm while subjects are experiencing the peak effect of, say, psilocybin. And if this research were to be done, and if the Rebus model were to be vindicated by such research, this could suggest that psychedelics have a unique ability to increase epistemic humility, which is a recognition of the limits of one's knowledge and an openness to new evidence or perspectives. If this is the case, I might go out on a limb and suggest that every academic institution should encourage and even fund access to psychedelics for all of their faculty members, which would be quite interesting, I think. So there's a lot of funding going into developing drugs that mimic the therapeutic effects of psychedelics without having the same perceptual and mystical effects. Often called psychoplastogens, these are drugs designed to target specific receptors, including the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, in a way that promotes neuroplasticity without causing hallucinations, or also influencing glutamate and BDNF pathways in ways that are similar to psychedelics. When these substances get evaluated clinically, I think it'll be important to assess if and how they influence belief change, and if this correlates with their therapeutic efficacy for the treatment of psychiatric conditions. Okay, so this has been quite a long presentation, at least probably longer than it could have been, but also shorter than it could have been. I still cut out a lot of information, and it's obviously a complex topic. But if you remember anything from this presentation, remember this: beliefs are very important. Classical psychedelics at high doses seem to relax deeply held beliefs, creating the opportunity for positive belief change. We need a lot more research to understand this, and the neuroscience of belief deserves more attention. Thank you.